The steady hum of the pottery wheel echoed through the quiet studio as Raylan Vance shaped clay with practiced hands, each piece a meditation against the grief that had consumed him for 3 years. Behind on studio rent, drowning in medical bills. From his daughter's final months, and now working late into the evening just to survive. He never expected that saving a stranger from the churning waters of Crescent Lake would shatter everything he believed about loss. When Gabriella Larson sputtered back to consciousness on the muddy shore, her antique silver locket had fallen open, revealing a photograph that stopped Raylan's heart. His daughter Mia, smiling in a garden he'd never seen, wearing clothes he'd never bought. The same daughter he'd watched slip away in a hospital bed. The same daughter he'd buried beneath the old oak tree. He never expected that one act of heroism would uncover a truth that would rewrite his entire understanding of love, loss, and the impossible possibility of second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Raylan Vance's calloused hands moved in slow, deliberate circles around the spinning clay, his fingers coaxing life from the earth-colored mass that centered on his pottery wheel. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of his studio, casting long shadows across shelves lined with bowls, vases, and sculptures in various stages of completion. Each piece told a story of patient transformation. Rough clay, becoming something beautiful, functional, worthy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days creating things that would last for generations, yet he couldn't hold on to the one thing that mattered most. 3 years. 3 years since Mia had slipped away from him like water through his fingers. And still, every bowl he shaped reminded him of her small hands trying to mimic his movements on this very wheel. Every glaze he mixed brought back memories of her. Laughter as she splattered paint across her cheeks instead of the ceramic surface. Every firing of the kiln echoed with the absence of her. Excited chatter about which pieces would emerge transformed by the flames. The pottery studio in Willowbrook had been their sanctuary. A converted barn on the outskirts of town, surrounded by rolling hills and anchored by the pristine waters of Crescent Lake, just a quarter mile through the woods. He'd bought the property with dreams of teaching Mia the ancient art that had been passed down through generations of his family. Watching her grow into a woman who understood that beauty came from patience, that strength emerged from gentleness, that even broken things could be made whole again. Now the studio felt like a mausoleum of abandoned dreams. Raylan lifted his foot from the wheel's pedal, allowing the clay to slow its hypnotic spinning. The piece before him, a simple cereal bowl, had taken shape almost without his conscious involvement. Muscle memory guided his hands these days, leaving his mind free to wander through the labyrinth of regret and longing that had become his constant companion. The brass clock above his desk chimed 6 times, its melodic tone cutting through the studio's silence. 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening meant most of Willowbrook's residents were gathering around dinner tables, sharing stories of their day, planning weekend adventures, living the kind of normal life that felt as foreign to Raylan as speaking a language he'd never learned. He should close the studio, head back to his small apartment above the town's only coffee shop, heat up whatever frozen meal was waiting in his freezer. But the thought of those 4 walls, filled with photos he couldn't bear to look at and belongings he couldn't bring himself to pack away, sent a familiar wave of panic through his chest. Better to stay here, surrounded by the comforting smell of clay and the steady rhythm of work. But better to keep his hands busy, his mind occupied with the mechanical processes of creation that required just enough attention to keep the darker thoughts at bay. The studio door chimed as someone entered, the small brass bell he'd installed echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Raylan looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Chun from the tea shop next door, who often stopped by to admire his work and share local gossip. Instead, a young couple stood hesitantly in the doorway, holding hands and scanning the displayed pottery. with the kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm that usually meant wedding planning. "Hi," the woman said, her voice bright with nervous energy. "Are you still open? We're looking for something special for our engagement party next month." Ryland forced a smile, wiping his clay-covered hands on the apron tied around his waist. "Of course. What kind of piece were you thinking about?" "Something that tells a story," the man replied, stepping closer to examine a set of dinner plates glazed in deep blues and greens. "Sarah's grandmother always said that pottery holds memories better than photographs. We want something that will grow more meaningful with time." The words hit Ryland like a physical blow. Sarah's grandmother was right, pottery did hold memories. Every crack, every imperfection, every slight variation in glaze told the story of its creation. His studio was filled with pieces that chronicled the happiest period of his life, each one a tangible reminder of afternoons spent teaching small fingers to center clay, of proud smiles when a wobbly first bowl emerged intact from the kiln, of dreams that felt as solid and permanent as the ceramics themselves. "I have some serving pieces that might work," he managed, leading them toward a display case near the window. This set was inspired by the lake. The glaze changes color depending on the light, just like the water does throughout the day. As the couple examined the pieces, murmuring to each other about colors and sizes, Ryland found himself studying their faces. They couldn't be older than 25, probably fresh out of college, still believing in forever and happily ever after, still trusting that life would unfold according to their carefully laid plans. He envied them that innocence. "These are perfect," Sarah said, running her finger along the rim of a large serving bowl. "How much for the complete set?" Ryland quoted a price that was probably too low, but the joy on their faces reminded him why he'd started creating in the first place. Art wasn't supposed to be about profit margins and business plans. It was supposed to be about connection, about creating something that would outlast its maker and carry meaning forward into the future. After they left, their excitement trailing behind them like perfume, Ryland began the familiar ritual of closing the studio. He covered the remaining clay, cleaned his tools, and checked the kilns that were cooling from the morning's firing. Each task was performed with the precision born of repetition, a meditation that helped him transition from the creative space, where memories lived close to the surface, to the careful numbness required for survival. The sun was setting behind the hills as he finally locked the studio door, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reflected off crescent lakes, surface like scattered coins. It was the kind of evening that once would have inspired him to pack a picnic, to take Mia down to the water's edge, where they could skip stones and watch for the great blue heron that nested in the reeds. Now the lake felt like another reminder of all the moments they'd never shared. As Ryland walked toward his truck, keys jingling in his hand, he paused at the sound of raised voices carrying across the water. Laughter, probably. Young people from the college town 30 minutes away often came to Crescent Lake for evening swims or bonfire parties. The local sheriff usually turned a blind eye as long as they cleaned up after themselves and didn't disturb the peace. Something about these voices felt different, urgent, distressed. He dropped his keys back into his pocket and started walking toward the lake, his footsteps quickening as the voices became clearer. Not laughter, shouting, someone calling for help. Ryland broke into a run, his heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt in 3 years, the fierce, immediate pulse of someone else's need cutting through his own carefully maintained emotional distance. Whatever was happening at the lake, whatever crisis was unfolding in those pristine waters, it was about to change everything he thought he knew about loss, about hope, and about the impossible ways life could circle back on itself like clay on a wheel, offering second chances to those brave enough to shape them. Ryland's work boots pounded against the dirt path that wound through the birch trees separating his studio from Crescent Lake's shoreline. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, following the desperate sounds that had transformed from distant voices into unmistakable cries for help. His lungs burned with the effort, his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity he hadn't felt since those final nights in the hospital, when every breath Mia took felt like a gift he might not receive again. The path opened suddenly, onto the lake's rocky shore, and Ryland's eyes immediately found the source of the commotion. 20 yards from the bank, a woman's dark hair appeared and disappeared beneath the water's surface, her arms flailing in the uncoordinated movements of someone fighting to stay afloat. 2 teenage boys stood waist-deep in the shallows, their faces pale with terror. "We can't swim that far," one of them shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She just went under again." Ryland didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots and dove into the lake, the shock of cold water against his skin bringing every nerve to sharp attention. The clay dust that had coated his hands and forearms dispersed in brown clouds as he cut through the water with powerful strokes, his body remembering the swimming lessons his father had insisted upon during summers at his grandfather's lake house, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As he reached the spot where the woman had last surfaced, Ryland took a deep breath and dove beneath the lake's surface. The water was clearer than he'd expected, filtered by the natural springs that fed Crescent Lake, and he could see her form sinking slowly toward the bottom, her movements becoming sluggish as consciousness began to slip away. He wrapped his arm around her chest and kicked hard toward the surface, dragging both their bodies upward through the increasingly bright water until they broke through into the evening air. The woman was limp in his arms, her breathing shallow and labored, lake water streaming from her mouth and nose. "Call 911. Ryland shouted to the boys as he began swimming toward shore, supporting the woman's weight while fighting against his own exhaustion. Now! The journey back to the shallows felt endless, his muscles screaming with the effort of keeping both their heads above water. When his feet finally touched the rocky bottom, Ryland lifted the woman in his arms and carried her onto the narrow beach, laying her gently on the sandy earth beside a fallen log. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably in her early 30s, with delicate features and skin that would have been olive-toned if not for the blue pallor of near-drowning. Her dark hair was plastered against her skull, and her clothes designer jeans and a white cotton blouse that had probably cost more than Ryland made in a week clung to her slight frame. "Ma'am?" Ryland knelt beside her, checking for signs of breathing. "Can you hear me?" She coughed suddenly, water erupting from her lungs in violent spasms that shook her entire body. Ryland helped her turn onto her side, supporting her as she fought to clear her airways and draw clean air into her damaged lungs. "Easy," he murmured, the same gentle tone he'd once used to calm Mia during thunderstorms. "You're safe now. Just breathe." It took several minutes before her breathing stabilized and the violent coughing subsided. When she finally opened her eyes, they were the color of sea glass, green with flecks of gold that caught the fading sunlight. She stared at Ryland with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, her lips moving soundlessly as she tried to form words. "Don't try to talk yet," Ryland said, glancing toward the teenage boys who were hovering nearby, their faces still etched with guilt and terror. "The ambulance is coming. You're going to be okay." The woman struggled to sit up, one hand pressed against her chest as she fought to regulate her breathing. As she moved, something silver caught the light, a delicate chain around her neck that had become tangled during her struggle in the water. "Double quotes, my ... My locket," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Her fingers fumbled with the chain, trying to locate the pendant that had twisted behind her neck. "Here, let me help." Ryland reached around carefully, his fingers finding the tangled silver chain and gently working it free from her hair. The locket was an antique piece, elaborate and clearly valuable, with intricate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship from Another iridot as he lifted it over her head to examine the clasp, which had been damaged during her struggle in the water. The locket fell open in his hands. Time stopped. Inside the oval frame, protected by a small piece of glass, was a photograph. That sent ice shooting through Ryland's veins despite the warm evening air. A little girl with curly brown hair and bright hazel eyes, wearing a yellow sundress he'd never seen, standing in a garden filled with roses and white picket fencing that belonged to no place in his memory. The girl in the photograph was Mia. Mia, his daughter who had died 3 years ago after a 6-month battle with leukemia. His daughter whose small body he'd held during her final breath. His daughter whose grave he visited every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and reading aloud from the pottery books they'd once shared. The locket slipped from Ryland's numb fingers, landing in the sand with a soft thud. He stared at the woman, looked at her for the first time, searching her face for some explanation, some rational reason why she would be carrying a photograph of his dead daughter. Where ... His voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. Where? Did you get this? The woman followed his gaze to the fallen locket, and something shifted in her expression. The confusion was replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, followed immediately by what Ryland could only describe as terror. I ... She began, then stopped, her eyes darting between the locket and Ryland's face as if she were solving a puzzle that frightened her. I can explain, but not here, not like this. The distant wail of sirens cut through the evening air, growing closer with each passing second. The teenage boys were pointing toward the road, directing the emergency responders toward the lake's access path. Soon the beach would be filled with paramedics and police officers, questions and official reports that would turn this moment into a public record. My name is Gabriella Larson, the woman said quietly, her sea-glass eyes holding his with an intensity that made his chest tight. And if you're who I think you are, we need to talk. Soon. Before ... She stopped herself, glancing toward the approaching sirens. Before what? Ryland demanded, but the paramedics were already crashing through the trees, their heavy equipment and urgent voices transforming the quiet beach into a scene of controlled chaos. As they began their examination of Gabriella, checking her vitals, and preparing to transport her to the hospital for observation, she managed to catch Ryland's eye one more time. Willowbrook General, she whispered, tomorrow morning. Room 237, please. Then she was surrounded by medical professionals, loaded onto a stretcher, and carried away into the night, leaving Ryland alone on the beach with a damaged locket and a photograph that defied everything he believed about life, death, and the absolute finality of loss. He picked up the locket with trembling hands, staring once more at the impossible image inside. Mia's face smiled back at him from the yellowed photograph, but something was different about her expression. She looked older than he remembered, perhaps 6 or 7 instead of the 5-year-old who had died in his arms, and she looked happy. Genuinely, radiantly happy in a way that pierced his heart with equal measures of joy and anguish. Tomorrow, he would have answers. Tomorrow, Gabriella Larson would explain how she came to possess a photograph of his daughter that showed her alive and thriving in a world he'd never known existed. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Ryland Vance allowed himself to hope that death might not be the end of every story. Ryland sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled in the early morning air. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, the damaged locket resting on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. He'd been sitting here for 20 minutes, watching the steady stream of visitors and medical staff, flowing through Willowbrook General's automatic doors, each person moving with purpose while he remained frozen between desperate hope and protective cynicism. The photograph had kept him awake all night. Every time he'd closed his eyes, Mia's face had appeared behind his eyelids, not the pale, weakened version from those final hospital days, but the vibrant, healthy girl captured in Gabriella's locket. A girl who looked like his daughter, but seemed to exist in some parallel universe where leukemia hadn't stolen her future before it began. Sleep had finally come in fragments around 4 in the morning, filled with dreams that felt more like memories. Mia laughing as she centered clay on the pottery wheel. Mia covered in glaze, more paint on her clothes than on the ceramic piece she was decorating. Mia curled against his chest during late-night fever spikes, her small hand clutching his shirt. As she fought against the disease ravaging her tiny body, he'd awakened with tears on his cheeks and the absolute certainty that pursuing this impossible hope would destroy what little peace he'd managed to construct from the wreckage of his grief, the rational part of his mind. The part that had learned to function in a world without his daughter insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps Gabriella was a grief counselor who used photographs of deceased persons in her work. Perhaps she was running some elaborate scam, targeting bereaved parents with cruel promises of reunion. Perhaps the near drowning had caused him to hallucinate, his desperate mind projecting Mia's face onto the image of a stranger's offspring. Any of these explanations made more sense than the alternative. His heart was whispering that Mia was somehow impossibly still alive. Ryland's phone buzzed against the dashboard, displaying a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Foster, who managed the coffee shop below his apartment. Rent reminder 3 months behind. Need to discuss payment plan this week, or we'll have to ask you to vacate. Sorry, honey. Sorry, honey. The message hit him like cold water. In his obsession with the locket and its impossible contents, he'd momentarily forgotten the grinding reality of his financial situation. The pottery studio generated barely enough income to cover its own expenses, let alone provide for his basic living costs. He'd been surviving on credit cards and the dwindling savings account that had once been earmarked for Mia's college fund. Even if, and it was an enormous if, Gabriella's photograph represented some miracle he couldn't comprehend. He couldn't afford to chase fantasies. He had responsibilities, debts, a business that required his attention. The couple who'd bought the engagement dinnerware yesterday would be expecting their order completed within 2 weeks. The gallery in Burlington had commissioned a series of planters for their spring exhibition. Mrs. Chun was waiting for the replacement teapot he'd promised after her granddaughter had broken her favorite piece. These were real obligations, tangible commitments that existed in the world he'd learned to navigate. They didn't require him to believe in impossibilities or risk, the emotional stability he'd fought so hard to achieve. Ryland reached for the ignition key, ready to drive away from Willowbrook General and return to the safe predictability of clay and glazes. But his hand stopped midway to the key as another memory surfaced, one he'd tried to bury along with his daughter. The night before Mia died, she'd awakened from a medication-induced sleep and gripped his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes had been unusually clear, free from the haze that had clouded them for weeks. "Daddy," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment's constant humming. "Promise me something." "Anything, sweetheart. Promise you won't stop believing in magic. Even when I'm gone, there's still magic in the world. You just have to be brave enough to see it." He'd promised, of course, the way parents promise anything to ease their offspring's suffering. But in the 3 years since her death, he'd systematically eliminated every trace of magic from his existence. No more bedtime stories about fairy godmothers and wishes coming true. No more encouraging her to leave cookies for Santa or search for Easter eggs hidden by mythical bunnies. No more pretending that love could conquer death or that prayers could heal what medicine couldn't touch. He'd chosen safety over wonder, numbness over hope, because the alternative remaining opened to possibilities in a universe that had stolen. His most precious gift felt like volunteering for endless heartbreak, but sitting in this parking lot, holding a photograph that defied every rational explanation. Ryland found himself caught between the promise he'd made to a dying offspring and the protective walls he'd built to survive her absence. His phone rang. jolting him from his internal struggle. The caller ID showed the name of his business insurance agent, and Rylan knew without answering that it would be another overdue notice, another reminder of his precarious financial situation. "Mr. Vance, this is Janet from Midwest Insurance. I'm calling about your commercial policy premium. We haven't received payment for the last 2 months, and I'm afraid we'll have to cancel your coverage if we don't hear from you by Friday." Rylan closed his eyes, listening to Janet's professional sympathy as she explained payment options and grace periods. Without insurance, he couldn't operate the pottery studio. Without the studio, he had no income. Without income, he'd lose the small apartment that had become his refuge from the world's constant reminders of loss. "I understand," he told Janet, though understanding and having solutions were entirely different things. "I'll call you back this afternoon." After ending the call, Rylan stared at the hospital's entrance and felt the weight of his carefully ordered life pressing down on his shoulders. He'd built his post-Mia existence around control, routine, and emotional distance. Every decision was filtered through practical considerations. Would it pay the bills? Would it require minimal human interaction? Would it allow him to function without confronting the magnitude of his loss? Meeting with Gabriella Larson violated every one of these carefully constructed guidelines. She represented chaos, emotional risk, and the terrifying possibility that everything he believed about his daughter's death might be wrong. But she also represented the first crack in the wall of grief that had defined his existence for 3 years. And despite every rational argument against it, despite the bills and the debts and the safer path back to his studio, Rylan found himself getting out of the truck and walking toward the hospital doors. He told himself he was going inside to get answers, to resolve the mystery so he could return to his life with a clear conscience. He told himself that 5 minutes of conversation would provide a logical explanation that would put this impossible hope to rest forever. But as the automatic doors slid open and he stepped into the hospital's familiar antiseptic atmosphere, Rylan knew he was lying to himself. He was here because a part of him, the part that had once believed in magic and miracles, was still alive, still whispering that love might be stronger than death, that some promises transcend the grave, and that even the most careful plans for emotional survival could be undone by the radical possibility of joy. Room 237 was just down the hall, and with each step toward it, Rylan felt the foundation of his grief-constructed world beginning to tremble. Room 237 was bathed in the soft morning light, filtering through gauze curtains, and Gabriella Larson looked markedly better than she had the previous evening. Her color had returned to a healthy olive tone, and her sea-glass eyes held a clarity that suggested the trauma of near drowning had passed. She was sitting upright in the hospital bed, wearing a standard-issue gown that somehow managed to look elegant on her slight frame, her dark hair pulled back to reveal the delicate bone structure of her face. When Rylan appeared in the doorway, Locket clutched in his hand like a talisman. Gabriella's expression shifted through a series of emotions: relief, apprehension, and something that looked remarkably like recognition tinged with sorrow. "You came," she said softly, gesturing for him to enter. "I wasn't sure you would." Rylan stepped into the room, but remained near the door, his body language broadcasting the internal conflict between desperate hope and protective caution. "I need answers about this." He held up the locket, its silver surface catching the morning light. Before Gabriella could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew both their attention. A young voice, high-pitched with distress, echoed against the hospital's sterile walls. "I don't want the shot. Please, I don't want it." Rylan's entire posture changed, his shoulders squaring as the sound of a frightened youngster activated something deep in his protective instincts. Without conscious thought, he moved toward the doorway, peering out to see a scene that was achingly familiar. A boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old was pressed against the far wall of the corridor, his small frame shaking as A nurse approached with a syringe. His parents flanked him, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that Rylan recognized from his own months. In pediatric oncology wards, the bone-deep weariness of those fighting a battle they might not win. "Tommy, sweetheart, it's just medicine to help you feel better," his mother was saying, her voice breaking slightly on the words. The little boy shook his head violently, tears streaming down cheeks that were too pale, too thin. "It hurts. They all hurt. I want to go home." Rylan found himself stepping into the hallway before he'd made a conscious decision to move. The familiar antiseptic smell, the institutional lighting, the sound of medical equipment humming in the background, it all transported him back to those endless days and nights when he'd been the one trying to comfort a terrified youngster who didn't understand why her body was betraying her. "Hey there," Rylan said gently, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "That's some pretty serious superhero hair you've got there." Tommy looked up, momentarily distracted from his fear. His hair had been buzzed short, probably to make the medical procedures easier, but Rylan spoke as if it were the most magnificent mane he'd ever seen. "It's not superhero hair," Tommy mumbled. "It's sick hair. Are you kidding me?" Raylan's voice carried the same warm incredulity he'd once used to convince Mia that her bald head was beautiful. "That's the exact same haircut as Captain America. I bet if we asked the nurse, she'd tell us that all the strongest heroes have hair just like yours." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, caught on immediately. "Oh, absolutely," she agreed. "In fact, this medicine we need to give you. It's the same kind of super serum that Captain America uses to stay strong." Tommy's eyes widened slightly, his fear momentarily overtaken by curiosity. "Really?" Rylan nodded solemnly. "Cross my heart. But here's the thing about superhero medicine. It only works if you're really, really brave. Like the bravest person in the whole hospital." "I don't feel brave," Tommy whispered. "Can I tell you a secret?" Rylan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you're scared. And getting medicine so you can get better and protect the people you love, that's the bravest thing in the world." Tommy considered this, glancing at his parents and then back at Rylan. "Did Captain America cry when he got his medicine?" "I bet he did," Rylan said honestly. "I bet he cried and was scared and wanted his mom to hold his hand. But he knew that being strong enough to help other people was worth a few minutes of being uncomfortable." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Tommy's shoulders straightened slightly, and he reached out to take his mother's hand. "Will you count to 10 with me while the nurse gives me the super serum?" As the family prepared for the injection, Tommy's father approached, Rylan with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We've been fighting this battle for 6 months, and sometimes ... He paused, struggling with emotion. "Sometimes it's hard to remember that he's still just a little boy who needs to believe in heroes." "He is a hero," Rylan replied, watching as Tommy bravely submitted to the injection while his mother counted slowly to 10. "You all are." When Rylan returned to Gabriella's room, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. There was wonder there, and sadness, and something that looked almost like recognition. "You've done that before," she said. It wasn't a question. Rylan took the chair beside her bed, suddenly feeling exhausted by the emotional weight of the encounter. "My daughter was sick for 6 months before she died. Leukemia. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, watching her try to be brave when she was more scared than any person should ever have to be." How old was she? 5 when she died. She would have been 8 now. He looked down at the locket in his hands, then back up at Gabriella. The same age as the girl in this photograph. Gabriella's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and impossible possibilities. "That little boy," Gabriella said finally, He reminded you of her. Every sick youngster reminds me of her. Every scared parent reminds me of myself. Raylan's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he opened the locket again, staring at the impossible photograph. I can't turn it off, the need to help them. Even though being around hospitals makes me feel like I'm drowning, even though every crying little person breaks my heart all over again. Why? Gabriella asked softly. Raylan was quiet for a long moment, remembering Mia's words from that final night, her insistence that he continue believing in magic even after she was gone. Because she asked me to. Because someone has to tell them they're brave enough to be heroes, even when they're too small to carry the weight of the world. He looked up at Gabriella, and the walls he'd built around his grief seemed to grow thinner, more transparent. She made me promise to keep helping other people find their courage, even after she couldn't be brave anymore herself. Gabriella's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand where it held the locket. She sounds like an extraordinary little girl. She was. Ryland's voice broke slightly. Which is why I need to know how. You have her photograph. I need to know why a woman I've never met is carrying a picture of my dead daughter who looks older and healthier than she ever was in life. Gabriella withdrew her hand, her expression shifting from sympathy to something more complex: fear, hope, and what looked like the weight of a secret too large to bear alone. Rylan, she said carefully, what if I told you that everything you believe about your daughter's death might be wrong? What if the little girl you just helped, the courage you just gave him, what if that was exactly the kind of person Mia grew up to be? The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, offering passage to a destination that defied every law of nature and reason that Rylan had spent 3 years learning to accept. Gabriella's words echoed in the Vyonga sterile hospital room, each syllable carrying implications that made Raylan's hands shake as he gripped the locket. The photograph of Mia seemed to pulse with possibility, her captured smile both familiar and impossibly foreign. That's not possible, Rylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I held her when she died. I watched them. I was there when they ... When they pronounced her dead, Gabriella finished gently. I know. But what if that wasn't the end of her story? Before Raylan could respond, Gabriella's phone buzzed against the bedside table. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted to one of professional concern. I'm sorry, she said, looking back at Rylan with genuine regret. This is going to sound strange, but I need to make a call. There's a situation at the children's wing that requires my immediate attention. The children's wing? Rylan studied her face, noting the way her earlier vulnerability had been replaced by focused determination. What kind of situation? Gabriella was already reaching for her phone, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I work for an organization that helps families navigate medical crises. We received an emergency referral last night about a family whose insurance is about to be canceled. Their 7-year-old son needs continued treatment, but without coverage ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Rylan understood the devastating mathematics of medical bankruptcy, the impossible choices families faced when insurance companies decided that some lives weren't worth the cost of saving. The boy in the hallway, Rylan said, understanding dawning. Tommy Morrison. His family has been fighting his leukemia for 6 months, just like... She paused, her eyes meeting his with significant weight. Just like Mia did. The phone call that followed revealed a side of Gabriella that surprised Raylan with its competence and quiet authority. She spoke with insurance representatives, hospital administrators, and social workers, navigating bureaucratic mazes with the ease of someone who had spent years learning to manipulate systems designed to fail vulnerable families. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Gabriella Larson from the Morrison Family Foundation. She said into the phone, her voice carrying a tone of polite steel. I'm calling about the Morrison account. We're prepared to establish a payment guarantee for Tommy's continued treatment." As she spoke, Ryland found himself studying her with growing curiosity. The woman who had nearly drowned the previous evening was clearly much more than a casual victim of circumstance. She moved through complex financial negotiations with the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding considerable resources, yet her personal investment in Tommy's case seemed to run deeper than professional obligation. "No, I don't need to review the policy details," Gabriella was saying. "I'm familiar with the exclusions. What I need is your commitment that treatment won't be interrupted while we arrange alternative funding." When she ended the call 20 minutes later, Tommy's treatment was secured for the next 6 months, and his family's financial crisis had been transformed into a manageable payment plan. "How did you do that?" Raylan asked, genuinely impressed despite his emotional turmoil. "Practice," Gabriella replied, but there was something evasive in her tone. "I've been helping families navigate medical crises for several years now. What kind of organization do you work for?" Gabriella set her phone aside and looked at him carefully, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. "It's a private foundation that focuses on pediatric patients. We provide financial assistance, advocacy, and double quote." She paused. "And sometimes we help families who have been failed by the traditional medical system." Something in her phrasing triggered a memory in Ryland's mind. During Mia's treatment, he'd heard whispers about alternative programs, experimental therapies, and wealthy benefactors who occasionally swept in to offer hope where conventional medicine had reached its limits. He'd never pursued those leads, trusting entirely in the doctors who had promised to fight for his daughter until the very end. "Experimental therapies," he said slowly. "That's what you're talking about, isn't it?" Gabriella's careful composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like confirmation mixed with apprehension. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happen outside traditional channels. Sometimes families need options that aren't available through standard protocols. And sometimes those families are told their offspring have died when they've actually been enrolled in programs so experimental that they can't be officially acknowledged. Ryland continued, the pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to align. In his mind, Gabriella's silence was answer enough. Ryland stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the hospital's courtyard below. Families sat on benches beneath spreading oak trees, some holding young patients wrapped in colorful blankets, others engaged in quiet conversations about prognoses and treatment plans. It was a scene he knew intimately, having spent countless hours in similar spaces while Mia underwent procedures that grew increasingly desperate as her condition worsened. "Show me something," he said suddenly, turning back to face Gabriella. "If you really know about Mia, if she's really—" "If what you're suggesting is true, then prove it. Tell me something about her that only someone who actually knew her would know." Gabriella reached into the small bag beside her bed and withdrew a tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen with purpose, and when she turned it toward Ryland, his knees nearly buckled. The screen displayed a video, clearly taken in some kind of art studio. A young girl who looked exactly like Mia, but older, healthier, with full hair and bright eyes, was working at a pottery wheel. Her small hands moved with competent precision. As she centered clay, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, exactly the way Mia's always had when she was focused on a challenging task. "She still does that thing with her tongue when she's concentrating," the girl in the video was saying to someone off camera. "Just like Daddy taught me. Center the clay first, then let it tell you what it wants to become." Ryland sank into the chair beside Gabriella's bed, his legs no longer capable of supporting his weight. The voice was older, more mature, but unmistakably familiar. The mannerisms, the way she held her shoulders, the careful way she approached the spinning clay, it was all heartbreakingly, impossibly familiar. "She talks about you constantly," Gabriella said softly. "About the pottery lessons, About the stories you used to read together. About how you taught her that broken things could always be made beautiful again if someone was patient enough to understand them. This is impossible, Rylan whispered. But his protest lacked conviction. The evidence was literally in his hands, a living, breathing version of his daughter who had somehow grown and thrived in a world he'd never known existed. The Foundation has very strict protocols, Gabriella continued. Families can't know about the experimental programs until we're certain they'll be successful. Too many hopes have been raised and shattered. Too many families have been destroyed by false promises. But she's alive. She's alive and she's healthy, and she misses her father every single day. Raylan looked up from the tablet to find Gabriella watching him with an expression of infinite compassion. Why now? Why are you telling me this now? Because she's 8 years old, and she's asking questions we can't answer anymore. Because she deserves to know that her father didn't abandon her, that he thought she was dead, and because ... Gabriella's voice caught. Because I made a promise to a little girl, that I would find a way to bring her home. The locket felt warm in Rylan's palm, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of miracles. The tablet trembled in Rylan's hands as he watched the video loop back to the beginning, showing Mia his impossibly alive daughter laughing as she explained pottery techniques to her unseen instructor. Each repetition of her voice saying, "Just like Daddy taught me," sent shockwaves through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his grief. "How long?" he whispered, unable to look away from the screen. "How long has she been? How long? Have you known she was alive?" Gabriella shifted in her hospital bed, her sea-glass eyes reflecting a depth of pain that Raylan was only beginning to understand. "Since the beginning. I was there the night she was transferred to the program." "You were there?" Rylan's head snapped up, searching her face for recognition that stubbornly refused to come. "I don't remember you. I remember every doctor, every nurse, every person who walked into that room during those final days." "I wasn't medical staff," Gabriella said softly. I was what you might call a scout. Someone who identifies candidates for experimental therapies when traditional medicine has exhausted its options." She reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, her movements deliberate, as if she were buying time to find the right words. "The Morrison Family Foundation has partnerships with research facilities around the world. Sometimes we encounter cases where the patient's condition is so advanced that attempting experimental treatment would be considered medical negligence under normal circumstances." "So you wait until they're dying," Rylan said, his voice flat, with a mixture of understanding and horror. "We wait until the family has been told to prepare for the worst, yes. Because only then can we offer alternatives that carry significant risks, along with the possibility of complete recovery." Rylan set the tablet aside and leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling with the implications. "You let me believe my daughter was dead for 3 years because it was easier than telling me she might survive an experimental treatment. No." Gabriella's voice carried a sharpness that cut through his rising anger. "We let you believe she was dead because she had a 14% chance of surviving the treatment, and we'd rather have one grieving parent than an entire family destroyed by false hope and ultimate failure." The words hit him like a physical blow, but beneath the hurt, Rylan recognized the terrible logic. He'd seen families in the pediatric ward who had chased every experimental therapy, every promising trial, only to watch their offspring suffer through procedures that prolonged death rather than preserving life. What changed? He asked. Why? "Tell me now if the risks were so significant." Gabriella was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her hospital blanket. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that transformed her from mysterious benefactor into something more human, more fragile. "Because I know what it's like to lose a child and spend years wondering if you could have done something different," she said. And I know what it's like to discover that the choices you made in the name of protection actually caused more pain than healing. She looked up at Rylan, and he saw his own grief reflected in her eyes, the particular devastation that belonged only to parents who had outlived their offspring. I had a daughter once too, Gabriella continued. Isabella. She was 6 when she was diagnosed with a rare form of brain cancer. The doctors gave her 3 months, maybe 6, with aggressive treatment. Rylan felt something shift in his chest. The familiar recognition of shared tragedy that created instant, unwanted kinship among bereaved parents. I was working in pharmaceutical research then, developing new therapies for pediatric cancers. When Isabella got sick, I threw everything I had into finding experimental treatments, pulling every favor, using every connection. Gabriella's voice grew distant, as if she were narrating someone else's story. I enrolled her in a trial that was so new, so untested, that only 12 children worldwide were participating. Did it work? For 3 months, it seemed like a miracle. Her tumors shrank, her energy returned. She started talking about what she wanted to be when she grew up. Gabriella's smile was heartbreaking in its mixture of joy and sorrow. Then her body began rejecting the treatment. The side effects were devastating. She died in agony, and her last words to me were asking why I'd let the doctors hurt her so much. Rylan reached across the space between them, covering Gabriella's hand with his own. The gesture was instinctive, born from the understanding that some pain could only be shared by those who had walked the same impossible path. So you started the foundation, he said. I started the foundation to spare other families the choice I had to make. To create protocols that would only offer experimental treatments to children who had genuine chances of success, and only after families had already begun the grieving process. She turned her hand over beneath his, their fingers interlocking with surprising naturalness. Mia was our 7th success story. Not our first attempt, but our first patient who responded so dramatically that we knew we had something genuinely revolutionary. And the families who don't know their children survived? We maintain contact through carefully managed channels. Video calls where the children think they're talking to therapists. Letters that are supposedly from pen pal programs. Gifts that appear to come from distant relatives. Gabriella's voice grew thick with emotion. It's not perfect, and it's not fair, but it preserves the children's psychological health while protecting families from the trauma of uncertainty. Rylan stared at their joined hands, processing the magnitude of what she was telling him. But Mia is asking questions now. She's 8 years old, and she's been asking about her father for months. She remembers the pottery studio, the lake, the bedtime stories about brave princesses who rescued themselves. She wants to know why Daddy never visits, why he doesn't send letters like the other children's families do. What did you tell her? The truth. That her daddy loves her very much but doesn't know she's alive. That sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult choices to keep the people they love safe. Gabriella squeezed his hand. And that someday, when she was strong enough and ready enough, we would find a way to bring her home. Rylan felt tears burning behind his eyes for the first time since Mia's funeral. Not the bitter, angry tears of grief, but something warmer, more complex, a mixture of overwhelming relief and profound loss for the 3 years they'd missed together. She doesn't hate me, he whispered, for not being there. She loves you. Exactly the way you taught her to love, completely, unconditionally, with the kind of faith that believes in magic even when the world seems determined to prove that miracles don't exist. Gabriella's voice broke. Just like you loved her. Loved her. In that moment, sitting in a sterile hospital room holding hands with a woman who had saved his daughter's life while allowing him to believe she was dead, Rylan understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain of loss. It was about discovering that love could survive even death, that some bonds were stronger than grief, and that sometimes the most profound acts of protection required the courage to let go of everything you thought you knew about hope and Impossibility. The locket rested. Between them on the hospital bed. Its silver surface catching the afternoon light. No longer a mystery, but a bridge connecting the father. He'd been to the father he might become again. Gabriella's phone erupted with an urgent, shrill ringtone that shattered the fragile intimacy of their shared revelations. She glanced at the screen, and the color drained from her face so completely that Rylan instinctively reached for her hand. "Dr. Harrison," she answered, her voice immediately shifting into professional mode despite the tremor Rylan could detect beneath the surface. "What's happening?" Raylan watched her expression shift from concern to alarm to something approaching panic as she listened to the voice on the other end. Her free hand clenched into a fist, her knuckles white against the hospital blanket. "How long do we have?" she asked, her eyes finding Rylan's with an intensity that made his stomach clench. "And you're certain it was Morrison? Tommy Morrison's case?" The name sent ice through Rylan's veins. The little boy he'd helped just hours earlier. The family whose insurance crisis Gabriella had resolved with a phone call somehow. They were connected to whatever emergency was unfolding. "I understand," Gabriella continued, her voice growing more strained with each word. "Initiate Containment Protocol 7. Move all the children to the secondary facility immediately. And Dr. Harrison? Erase everything connected to the Morrison intervention, everything." She ended the call and immediately began scrolling through her contacts, her fingers moving with frantic urgency. "What's happening?" Raylan demanded, but Gabriella was already placing another call. "Marcus, it's Gabriella. We have a problem. The Morrison family's insurance company flagged our payment guarantee. They're asking questions about the foundations, funding sources, and ... quotes." She paused, listening. "Yes, I know what this means. How long before the audit team arrives?" Rylan felt the familiar sensation of watching a medical crisis unfold. The sudden shift from hope to emergency, the way normal. Time seemed to compress into urgent moments that would determine everything that followed. 48 hours, Gabriella said after ending the second call. "We have 48 hours before federal investigators arrive to examine our financial records, our treatment protocols, and our patient files. What does that mean for Mia?" "It means the experimental program is over." Gabriella's voice was hollow, defeated. "All of it. The children who are currently in treatment will be transferred to traditional facilities. The families will be told their offspring died from complications related to their original diagnoses. And anyone who has knowledge of the program's existence will be prosecuted for medical fraud, insurance fraud, and child endangerment." The room seemed to tilt around Rylan as the implications crashed over him. "They'll say Mia died. Again. Worse than that." Gabriella was already reaching for her clothes, her movements sharp with desperation. "They'll actually let her die. The treatment that's keeping her healthy requires very specific protocols that don't exist in traditional pediatric oncology. Without the Foundation's resources, without the experimental medication regimen, her cancer will return within weeks." Rylan stood up so quickly that his chair overturned, the metallic crash echoing in the small room. "Then we get her out. We take her and run." "Where?" Gabriella's question was brutal in its simplicity. "She needs medical supervision 24 hours a day. The medication has to be prepared in specialized labs that cost millions of dollars to maintain. Even if we could disappear with her, we'd be watching her die slowly while living as fugitives. There has to be another way. There is." Gabriella pulled on her clothes with mechanical efficiency, her professional demeanor reasserting itself even as her hands shook. "I can claim full responsibility for the Morrison intervention. Tell the investigators that I acted without foundation approval, that I used my personal resources to guarantee payment for a family I'd become emotionally invested in. What would happen to you? Prison, most likely. 5 to 10 years for insurance fraud. But the Foundation could claim I was a rogue agent, distance themselves from my actions, and continue operating under heightened scrutiny. She turned to face him, her sea-glass eyes blazing with fierce determination. The other children would be safe. Mia would be safe, and you'd lose everything. I lost everything 8 years ago when Isabella died. Gabriella's voice carried the weight of old grief, but also something harder, more resolute. This time, at least the sacrifice would save lives instead of destroying them. Raylan felt the walls of the hospital room closing in around him, the familiar sensation of being trapped between impossible choices. 3 years ago, he'd faced similar moments, decisions that required him to choose between hope and realism, between fighting and acceptance. He'd chosen acceptance then, trusting the doctors who'd told him that Mia's case was hopeless. Now he was being asked to choose again, but this time the stakes were even higher. Not just his daughter's life, but the lives of 7 other children whose families believed they were dead. Not just his own grief, but Gabriella's freedom and the future of an organization that had achieved what traditional medicine couldn't. What if there was a third option? He said suddenly, an idea crystallizing in his mind with the clarity that sometimes emerged from desperation. What do you mean? You said the investigation was triggered by questions about the Foundation's funding sources. What if those questions could be answered legitimately? What if there was a way to make the Morrison payment completely legal and transparent? Gabriella stared at him, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. The Foundation's resources come from very carefully managed offshore accounts. Everything is structured to maintain donor anonymity and avoid government oversight. There's no way to make it transparent without exposing the entire operation. But what if the payment didn't come from the Foundation? Raylan pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. What if it came from a private citizen who had the resources to guarantee a medical payment? Raylan, you said yourself that you're behind on rent. You don't have the kind of money required to, but I know someone who does. He held up his phone, showing her a contact labeled Heritage Trust, Estate Division. Mia had a trust fund, money my parents set aside for her education, managed by the family law firm. When she died, the funds were supposed to revert to a charity of my choosing, but I never could bring myself to make that decision. Understanding dawned in Gabriella's eyes. How much money? $250,000. More than enough to cover Tommy Morrison's treatment costs and establish a legitimate paper trail that would satisfy any investigation. But if you use that money, there's no going back. The investigators will want to interview you, examine your connection to the Morrison family. You'll be exposed to the entire Foundation operation. Raylan thought about Mia working at the pottery wheel in the video, her small hands creating something beautiful while she talked about the father, who had taught her to center clay and trust in the possibility of transformation. He thought about Tommy Morrison, scared and brave in equal measure, needing to believe that heroes existed in a world that often felt determined to prove otherwise. Then I'll be exposed, he said, his decision crystallizing with each word. But Mia will be alive, and Tommy will get his treatment. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to bring all those families back together without destroying the program that saved their children. Gabriella stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, admiration, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. You understand what you're risking? Your freedom, your future, any chance of a normal life? I lost my chance at a normal life 3 years ago when I thought my daughter died, Raylan replied. But if there's even the smallest possibility that she can come home, that we can be a family again, then there's no risk I won't take. Outside the hospital window, storm clouds were gathering over Willowbrook, darkening the afternoon sky with the promise of turbulent weather ahead. But for the first time since holding his daughter's lifeless hand in a different hospital room, Raylan felt something other than resignation in the face of an impossible situation. He felt the fierce, Complicated hope of a parent willing to fight for miracles, even when the cost of fighting might be everything else he had left to lose. The law offices of Heritage Trust occupied an entire floor of Willowbrook's tallest building. Its mahogany-paneled conference room, overlooking the town where Rylan had built and lost his life with Mia. He sat across from James Patterson, the estate attorney who had managed his family's legal affairs for 3 generations, while Gabriella studied financial documents with the focused intensity of someone calculating the precise trajectory needed to thread a needle while blindfolded. "Let me understand this correctly," Patterson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the trust documentation. "You want to liquidate Mia's entire education fund to guarantee medical treatment for a family you've never met. And you want to do it in a way that creates an unshakable legal paper trail?" "That's exactly what I want," Rylan confirmed, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "The Morrison family needs immediate financial backing for their son's treatment, and it needs to come from a source that can withstand federal scrutiny." Patterson glanced at Gabriella, who had introduced herself as a family advocate working pro bono for the Morrison case. "Ms. Larson, you understand the implications of what Mr. Vance is proposing? This isn't just charity, this is the complete liquidation of a trust that was established to honor his daughter's memory." "I understand," Gabriella replied, meeting the attorney's gaze with calm professionalism. "But I also understand that Mia would have wanted her legacy to help other children facing the same battle she fought." The truth of those words hit Rylan like a physical force. Even in their current impossible circumstances, Gabriella understood his daughter in ways that transcended the years they'd been separated. Mia would have insisted on helping Tommy Morrison, would have been furious to learn that other families were suffering while money sat unused in an account bearing her name. "The legal mechanics are straightforward," Patterson continued, spreading several documents across the polished table. "The trust allows for charitable disbursements at your discretion. Mr. Vance, what's unusual is the speed you're requesting and the specific beneficiary structure. How quickly can it be done?" Gabriella asked, checking her phone for what Rylan knew was the latest update on the federal investigation timeline. With emergency filing protocols, 24 hours to establish the medical guarantee, 48 hours for complete fund transfer. Patterson studied both of them carefully. "But I have to ask, why the urgency?" "Most medical payment plans allow for extended negotiation periods." Rylan and Gabriella exchanged glances, the weight of secrets they couldn't share adding tension to the already complex legal maneuvering. They'd rehearsed their cover story during the drive from the hospital, but sitting in this formal setting, surrounded by the legal apparatus that governed their society's most fundamental transactions, the fiction felt more fragile than they'd anticipated. "Tommy Morrison's condition is deteriorating rapidly," Gabriella said, which was true, though not in the way Patterson would understand. "His family's insurance cancellation becomes effective in 18 hours. If we can't establish alternative funding by then, his treatment will be interrupted at a critical stage of his therapy. And interrupting treatment now could be fatal," Rylan added, the words carrying more truth than the attorney could possibly realize. Patterson nodded, his expression softening with the particular sympathy that legal professionals developed for cases involving children. "I'll initiate the emergency protocols. Ms. Larson, I'll need you to provide Tommy's family with these forms." He handed her a stack of documents. "They'll need to sign authorization for Mr. Vance to guarantee their medical expenses." "They'll sign," Gabriella assured him, though Rylan noticed the slight tension around her eyes that suggested this aspect of their plan carried risks they hadn't fully discussed. As Patterson began the process of liquidating the trust fund, Rylan found himself staring out the conference room's tall windows at the landscape that had defined his adult life. The pottery studio was visible in the distance, a converted barn that looked impossibly small from this height. Crescent Lake stretched beyond it, its surface reflecting the afternoon sky like hammered silver. Everything he could see represented the life he'd built and lost, the careful reconstruction of purpose that had carried him through 3 years of grief. Tomorrow, if their plan succeeded, that life would be gone. The trust fund that represented his connection to Mia's memory would be spent. His involvement with the Morrison family would be documented in legal filings that federal investigators would scrutinize. His name would be connected to an organization that had systematically deceived grieving families about their children's survival. But somewhere beyond his view, in a facility whose existence defied every assumption he'd made about medical ethics and parental loss, his daughter was alive and asking questions about the father who had never stopped loving her. "There's something else we need to discuss," Gabriella said quietly, drawing his attention back to the conference room. Patterson had stepped out to file the initial paperwork, leaving them alone with the legal documents that would reshape both their futures. "The reunion," Raylan said, understanding immediately. "The Foundation has protocols for family reintegration, but they've never been used in a situation like this. Usually, when families are reunited with their children, it's because the experimental treatment has reached a stable endpoint. The children are declared cured, their medical needs become manageable through conventional therapy, and reintegration can happen gradually over several months. But Mia's situation is different. Mia's treatment is ongoing. She needs specialized medical supervision for at least another 2 years, possibly longer. The Foundation can't simply hand her back to you and walk away. Her survival depends on continued access to experimental protocols that exist nowhere else in the world." Ryland felt a chill of understanding. "You're saying that even if we can resolve this investigation, even if we can establish legal funding for the Morrison family, I still can't take Mia home. Not in any conventional sense." Gabriella leaned forward, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "But there might be another way." She pulled out her tablet, navigating to a series of architectural drawings that looked like blueprints for a residential facility. "The Foundation has been developing a family integration program for situations exactly like ours. Instead of hiding the children from their families, we'd create a community where families could live together while the children receive the medical care they need." The drawings showed a complex of buildings designed to look like a small town, rather than a medical facility. Individual houses surrounded a central community center, with discrete medical facilities integrated into the architecture, so seamlessly that they appeared to be part of a normal neighborhood infrastructure. "It's beautiful," Raylan said, studying the plans with the eye of someone who understood how spaces could be designed to nurture healing. "But theoretical, right? This doesn't exist yet." "The funding was approved 6 months ago. Construction began last spring." Gabriella's voice carried a mixture of pride and apprehension. "The first phase is scheduled for completion in 3 weeks. The Morrison crisis has accelerated our timeline, but it's also provided an unexpected opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "If we can resolve the federal investigation, if we can establish the Morrison family's treatment funding through legitimate channels, then we can use this case as a pilot program for complete transparency. No more hidden children, no more grieving families who don't know their offspring survived. Full disclosure, full integration, with medical supervision provided openly rather than in secret." Raylan stared at the architectural drawings, his mind struggling to process the implications. "You're talking about revolutionizing how experimental pediatric medicine works. I'm talking about creating a world where families like yours don't have to choose between hope and honesty, where children like Mia don't have to grow up believing their parents abandoned them." Gabriella's eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who had found a way to transform personal tragedy into systemic change. "But it only works if we can survive the next 48 hours. Patterson returned with a stack of signed documents and the satisfied expression of an attorney who had successfully navigated complex bureaucratic requirements. "The emergency filing has been accepted, Mr. Vance. As of 30 minutes ago, you are the official guarantor of Tommy Morrison's medical expenses. The trust fund liquidation will be complete by tomorrow afternoon. And the paper trail? Gabriella asked. Impeccable. Every transaction will be documented through legitimate banking channels, with clear legal authorization and charitable intent clearly established. Patterson gathered the documents into a neat pile. If federal investigators examine this case, they'll find a straightforward example of private charity responding to a family medical crisis. Raylan felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time since Gabriella's phone had rung in the hospital room. They'd created a legitimate explanation for the Morrison family's sudden good fortune, one that would satisfy even intensive scrutiny. But their success had also committed him to a path that would transform his carefully constructed post-grief existence into something he couldn't yet imagine. "There's one more thing," Patterson said, his expression shifting to something more personal. "Mr. Vance, I knew your parents, and I knew how much they loved Mia. They would be proud of what you're doing with her trust fund. Using money meant to secure her future to help another child fight the same battle she faced. That's exactly the kind of legacy they would have wanted her to have. After leaving the law office, Raylan and Gabriella drove in silence through the winding roads that connected Willowbrook's town center to the rural areas where his pottery studio sat like a beacon of normalcy in a landscape that had been fundamentally altered by the day's revelations. "I should pack," Raylan said finally as they pulled into the studio's gravel parking area. "If I'm going to be part of this integration program, if I'm going to see Mia again, I should figure out what I want to bring from here." "Are you sure?" Gabriella asked. "Once we move forward with family reintegration, there's no going back to your life here. The federal investigation will connect you to the foundation permanently. Even if we're cleared of wrongdoing, you'll always be someone who is involved with experimental pediatric medicine and insurance fraud allegations." Raylan looked at the pottery studio, its familiar walls containing the artifacts of his attempts to create meaning from loss. Inside, shelves held pieces he'd made during the darkest period of his grief bowls, thrown with desperate intensity. Vases shaped by hands that needed something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was dissolving. "I've been making pottery for 3 years to keep my hands busy while my heart tried to heal," he said. "But the most important thing I ever created was watching Mia learn to center clay, teaching her that broken things could be made whole again, with patience and skill." He turned to face Gabriella, the woman who had saved his daughter's life while allowing him to believe she was dead, who had risked everything to give him the chance to be a father again. "If there's a possibility that I can teach her pottery again, that I can watch her grow up and become the person she's meant to be, then there's nothing in this studio worth keeping. The only thing that matters is in that video you showed me, learning to create beautiful things while talking about her daddy." As the sun set behind the hills surrounding Crescent Lake, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that Raylan had watched through 3 seasons of grief, he felt the last barriers around his heart beginning to dissolve. Tomorrow would bring federal investigators, insurance auditors, and legal challenges that could destroy everything they'd worked to accomplish. But tomorrow might also bring the sound of his daughter's voice saying his name, the weight of her arms around his neck, and the impossible joy of discovering that love could survive even the most absolute forms of loss. In 48 hours, he would either be holding Mia again or watching from a prison cell as the foundation collapsed and took her survival with it. The risk was everything. The reward was everything. And for the first time since he'd watched a small coffin disappear into the earth beneath an oak tree, Raylan Vance was ready to bet his entire future on the radical possibility of miracles. The federal investigators arrived at precisely 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, their black sedans forming a solemn procession through Willowbrook's quiet streets. Raylan watched from the window of Patterson's law office as they filed into the Morrison Family Foundation's temporary field office, their briefcases and serious expressions, promising the kind of scrutiny that could dismantle years of carefully constructed operations within hours. Gabriella sat across from him at the polished conference table, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against her coffee cup. She'd barely slept during the past 48 hours, coordinating with Foundation directors, medical staff, and legal teams to ensure that every aspect of their operation could withstand intensive investigation. The dark circles under her eyes spoke to the enormous pressure she'd been carrying, but her sea-glass gaze remained sharp with determination. "The Morrison payment cleared at 6 this morning," Patterson announced, entering the conference room with a stack of banking documents. "Every transaction is properly documented, every legal requirement satisfied. If the investigators examine the fund transfer, they'll find a textbook example of charitable medical assistance." "And Tommy's family?" Rylan asked. "Grateful beyond words and completely cooperative. They've provided full documentation of their son's medical history, insurance complications, and their interaction with Miss Larson's advocacy services. Their story is consistent and credible." Gabriella's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and her expression shifted from anxiety to something approaching relief. "Dr. Harrison just confirmed that all the children have been successfully transferred to the family integration facility. Medical continuity has been maintained, and none of the experimental treatment protocols have been interrupted, including Mia." Raylan's voice carried the particular tension of a parent who had learned that hope could be more terrifying than despair. "Including Mia. She's asking for you every day." Gabriella's smile was warm despite her exhaustion. "The medical team says she's been talking about pottery almost constantly since we told her you might visit soon." The word visit hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that none of them had fully addressed. Raylan's involvement with the Morrison case had created a legitimate connection to the Foundation's work, but it had also exposed him to legal scrutiny that would forever link his name to an organization operating at the very edge of medical ethics and legal boundaries. "There's something we need to discuss," Gabriella said, her tone shifting to something more formal, more careful. "About what happens after the investigation concludes." Patterson gathered his documents with the discreet efficiency of an attorney who recognized when clients needed privacy for conversations that transcended legal representation. "I'll be in my office if you need anything else." "The investigation team knows to contact me directly if they have questions about the trust fund liquidation." After he left, Gabriella moved to the window overlooking Willowbrook's town square, her reflection ghost-like against the glass as she watched federal agents examining documents in the building across the street. "The family integration facility is more than just a medical complex," she began, her voice carrying the weight of carefully rehearsed explanations. "It's designed to be a permanent community, where families can rebuild their lives while their children receive ongoing experimental care. You mentioned that before. Houses designed to look like a normal neighborhood. 35 families, each with their own residence. Shared community spaces including a school, recreation center, and yes, a fully equipped pottery studio." She turned from the window to face him, her expression mixing professional presentation with personal vulnerability. "The Foundation wants to offer you something more than just reunion with Mia." Raylan felt his heart rate increase as the implications began to crystallize. What kind of offer? Head of Creative Arts Therapy for the entire program. Not just pottery, but oversight of all artistic and creative healing modalities for families dealing with experimental medical treatments. Gabriella pulled out her tablet, navigating to a series of detailed architectural plans. "Your studio would be 10 times larger than what you have here, with equipment and resources that most professional artists never access." The plans were breathtaking in their scope and attention to detail. Multiple pottery wheels, kilns designed for both functional and artistic work, glazing laboratories that looked more sophisticated than what Rylan had seen in university art departments. But what captured his attention most were the smaller spaces integrated throughout the complex quiet corners designed for one-on-one instruction. Family workshops where parents and children could create together. Even outdoor areas with fire pits for primitive firing techniques. "This isn't just about giving me a job," Raylan said, studying the plans with growing understanding. "This is about creating something that's never existed before." Exactly. We're not just treating children with experimental medicine, we're developing new models for how families heal together when facing life-threatening illness. Gabriella's voice grew stronger, more passionate as she described the program's vision. Traditional medical facilities, separate families. Parents sit in waiting rooms while children undergo treatment. Siblings are shuffled between relatives. Everyone exists in a state of suspended anxiety, waiting for news that will determine their entire future. But this program keeps families together. More than that, it recognizes that healing happens in community, that children recover faster when they're surrounded by other families facing similar challenges, that parents need meaningful work and purpose while their children receive care. She gestured toward the architectural plans. Every family would have roles in maintaining the community. Some would teach in the school. Others would manage the organic gardens that provide fresh food for specialized diets. You would lead creative programs that help both children and adults process trauma through artistic expression. Rylan found himself thinking about Tommy Morrison, the little boy who had needed to believe in superheroes to find courage for a medical injection. How many other children in this program would benefit from pottery lessons that taught them they could create beauty from raw materials, that broken things could be made whole again with patience and skill? "What about the legal complications?" he asked. "My involvement with the Morrison case has connected me to the Foundation permanently. Even if this investigation clears us, there will always be questions about experimental treatments and insurance fraud allegations." "That's exactly why this program is so important," Gabriella replied. "Instead of operating in secret, we're creating a model that's completely transparent. Families would know exactly what treatments their children are receiving, understand the experimental nature of the therapies, and participate in informed consent processes that meet the highest ethical standards." She pulled up another document on her tablet, this one filled with legal and medical terminology that spoke to months of careful planning. The Family Integration Facility would operate under special federal research designation. Everything we do would be subject to oversight, but it would also be protected under experimental medicine protocols. Families would be full partners in the research process, not subjects being studied without their knowledge. And the children who are already in the program, the families who think their offspring died, that's the most complex part of the transition. Gabriella's expression grew somber. "Over the next 6 months, we'd gradually contact those families, explain what happened, and offer them the choice to join the integration program or transition their children to conventional medical care. Some families might not forgive you for letting them believe their children were dead. Some won't. We're prepared for that. But we're also prepared to demonstrate that our deception saved lives and that our new transparency can heal the damage we caused while creating better outcomes for future families." Rylan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town where he'd spent 3 years learning to function without his daughter. The pottery studio was visible in the distance, its familiar silhouette representing everything he'd built from the ashes of his grief. Leaving Willowbrook would mean abandoning not just his business, but the entire identity he'd constructed as a single man learning to find meaning in solitude. But staying would mean missing the chance to watch Mia grow up, to teach her advanced pottery techniques, to help her navigate the complex emotions of being a medical miracle, who remembered having a father who disappeared from her life. "There's something else," Gabriella said softly, joining him at the window. "Something personal that goes beyond professional opportunities." She was standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, subtle and warm, mixed with the lingering Scent of hospital antiseptic that seemed to cling to anyone who spent significant time around medical facilities. What do you mean? The integration program requires families to commit to the community for minimum periods, usually 2 to 3 years, while their children complete experimental treatments. That means you'd be living in the same place where I'm working, collaborating on programs that matter to both of us, helping families navigate the same impossible choices we've both faced. The implications of her words settled between them like a bridge spanning the gap between professional partnership and something more personal, more lasting. Gabriella, are you asking me to? I'm asking you to consider that this program could benefit from someone who understands both the creative process and the experience of parental loss. Someone who can teach families that healing happens gradually, the same way pottery emerges from shapeless clay through patient, repeated attention. Their eyes met in the window's reflection, and Rylan saw something that went beyond professional collaboration or even the shared purpose of reuniting him with his daughter. He saw the possibility of creating a life together that honored both their losses while building something meaningful from their combined experience. But I'm also asking, Gabriella continued, her voice dropping to something more vulnerable, whether you might be interested in exploring what happens when two people who understand grief discover they might understand each other too. Before Raylan could respond, his phone rang with Patterson's number displaying on the screen. The investigators want to speak with you, Patterson said without preamble. They're wrapping up their examination of the Morrison case, and they'd like to interview you about your decision to guarantee the family's medical expenses. Is that good or bad? It's routine. Your involvement is well documented and legally sound. This should be a straightforward conversation about your charitable intentions and your interaction with Miss Larson's advocacy services. After ending the call, Rylan found Gabriella watching him with an expression that mixed hope and apprehension. This is it, she said. Whatever the investigators conclude about our operations, whatever questions they have about the foundation's practices, after today we'll know whether the integration program can move forward or whether everything we've built will be dismantled, and whether I'll be able to see Mia again, and whether you'll choose to stay with us long enough to help build something that could transform how families experience medical crisis. Raylan looked once more at the town spread out below them, then at the architectural plans showing a community designed around healing and hope rather than secrecy and separation. I don't need to wait for the investigation to conclude, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I don't need more time to consider the professional opportunity or the personal implications. What are you saying? I'm saying that 3 years ago, I made pottery because I needed something to do with my hands while my heart tried to heal. But the most important thing I ever created was watching Mia learn that broken things could be made beautiful again. He turned to face Gabriella fully, seeing his own hope reflected in her sea-glass eyes. If there's a chance to teach her that lesson again, to help other families discover that love can survive even the most absolute losses, then there's no choice to make. Even knowing that it means leaving everything familiar, taking risks that could affect your entire future, especially knowing that. Rylan reached for her hand, their fingers interlocking with the same natural ease they'd found in the hospital room. Because some risks are worth taking, and some futures are worth fighting for, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. In the VNZ distance, federal investigators were concluding their examination of documents that would determine whether their carefully constructed plan had succeeded. Within hours, they would know whether the Morrison Family Foundation could transition from secretive experimental medicine to transparent family integration, whether families separated by medical crisis could be reunited without destroying the programs that had saved their children's lives. But regardless of the investigation's outcome, Raylan had made his choice. He would follow his daughter into whatever future awaited them, ready to discover whether the love between a father and child could be strong enough to rebuild a life that had been shattered by loss and reforged by the impossible possibility of second chances. 6 months later, Raylan stood at the edge of what had once been an empty field in the mountains of Vermont, watching his daughter demonstrate pottery techniques to a group of children whose families had gathered for the weekly community arts program. The family integration facility had transformed from architectural drawings into a living community that felt more like a small town than a medical complex. Its carefully designed buildings nestled among rolling hills that reminded him of the landscape around Crescent Lake. Mia had grown in the months since their reunion, not just physically, but with a confidence that came from being surrounded by other families who understood the complexity of surviving medical miracles. Her hair had grown back completely, a cascade of brown curls that caught the afternoon sunlight as she bent over her pottery wheel, her small hands guiding a piece of clay with the same focused intensity Raylan remembered from their sessions in his old studio. "Remember, the clay has to trust you before you can shape it," she was saying to 7-year-old Marcus, whose leukemia had been treated through the same experimental protocols that had saved her life. "If you try to force it too fast, it'll collapse. But if you're patient and gentle, it'll become whatever you imagine." Raylan felt Gabriella's hand slip into his as they watched from the pottery studio's observation deck, a space designed to allow family members to witness creative sessions without interrupting the flow of artistic work. Their relationship had deepened gradually over the months, built on shared understanding of loss and hope rather than dramatic romantic gestures. They'd learned to love each other the way pottery emerged from clay, slowly, patiently, with attention to each small detail. That contributed to the larger beauty they were creating together. "She sounds just like you," Gabriella murmured, her voice carrying the warmth that had become familiar during their evening walks through the community's winding paths. "She sounds like herself," Raylan replied, marveling at how his daughter had integrated the pottery lessons from their brief time together with wisdom gained through her own journey of survival and healing. "Better than I ever was at her age." The federal investigation had concluded 4 months earlier with findings that surprised everyone involved. Rather than discovering evidence of medical fraud or insurance manipulation, the investigators had documented a groundbreaking program that achieved unprecedented success rates in treating pediatric cancers previously considered terminal. The Morrison Family Foundation had been granted special research status, allowing them to continue their experimental work under enhanced oversight while transitioning to complete transparency with participating families. Tommy Morrison was thriving in the program's school system, his superhero haircut having grown out into the kind of thick, healthy mane that suggested his body had fully embraced the experimental treatments. His parents had become leaders in the community's family support network, helping newly arrived families navigate the emotional complexity of discovering that their children had survived diseases they'd been told were fatal. "Dad, watch this," Mia called from the pottery wheel, her voice carrying across the studio with the excited urgency of a child who had mastered a challenging technique. She was working on a vase, her hands moving with practiced confidence as she pulled the clay walls higher and thinner than Raylan had thought possible for someone her age. "That's incredible, sweetheart," he called back, genuinely impressed by her technical skill. "Where did you learn to pull walls that evenly?" "Mrs. Chun taught me," Mia replied, referring to the elderly pottery master who had joined the program's faculty after closing her tea shop in Willowbrook. "She says clay responds better to gentle persistence than dramatic force, just like healing." The wisdom in her words, the casual way she connected pottery techniques to life lessons about recovery and resilience reminded Raylan of how much his daughter had grown during their years apart. She understood things about survival and hope that most adults never learned, but she wore that knowledge lightly, using it to help other children rather than dwelling on her own miraculous journey. As the afternoon pottery session concluded and families began gathering for the community dinner that marked the end of each week, Rylan reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. Since that evening when he'd heard cries for help echoing across Crescent Lake, the financial sacrifice of liquidating Mia's trust fund had been returned tenfold through his work with the integration program. But more importantly, he discovered that purpose could emerge from the most devastating losses if someone was brave enough to trust in possibilities that seemed impossible. Dr. Vance called Sarah Martinez, mother of 10-year-old Isabella, whose brain tumor had been successfully treated through experimental immunotherapy. "Could you help us plan next month's family pottery exhibition? Isabella wants to display the piece she's been working on, but she's nervous about people seeing her work." "Of course," Rylan replied, automatically shifting into the role that had evolved naturally during his months at the facility. He was officially the director of creative arts therapy, but in practice, he'd become something closer to a community healer, someone who helped families process their trauma through artistic expression while building confidence in their children's continuing recovery. The family pottery exhibition had become one of the program's most anticipated events, not just because it showcased the artistic achievements of children who had defied medical expectations, but because it created opportunities for families to share their stories of loss and recovery with a community that understood the emotional complexity of their journeys. "Isabella's vase is beautiful," Mia said, joining the conversation with the easy confidence of a child who had learned to see artistic expression as a natural part of healing. "She should definitely display it. It tells the story of how strong she is." Sarah Martinez's eyes filled with tears at Mia's simple declaration, and Rylan felt the familiar swell of pride that came from watching his daughter instinctively understand how to offer encouragement that felt genuine rather than forced. "You know what, Mia?" Sarah said, kneeling to Isabella's eye level. "You're absolutely right. This vase does tell the story of my strength, and I think it's time for people to see that story." As families dispersed to prepare for dinner, Raylan and Gabriella walked slowly through the community's central garden, where children who had completed their experimental treatments worked alongside their parents to maintain herb and vegetable plots that provided fresh ingredients for the facility's specialized nutrition programs. "The Foundation's board approved the expansion proposal today," Gabriella said, her voice carrying satisfaction mixed with the exhaustion that came from months of careful planning and negotiation. "By next spring, we'll be able to accommodate 50 additional families, with 3 more creative art studios and an expanded medical facility. 50 more families who won't have to choose between hope and honesty," Rylan observed, still marveling at how the program had evolved from secretive experimental medicine into a transparent model that was being studied by medical facilities around the world. 50 more children who won't have to grow up believing their parents abandoned them, Gabriella added, her voice carrying the weight of personal understanding that would always inform her professional decisions. They paused at a bench overlooking the community's small lake, where several families were skipping stones while their children played in the shallow water under careful medical supervision. The scene was so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that it would have been easy to forget these were families whose lives had been shattered by medical crises that conventional medicine couldn't resolve. "I have something for you," Gabriella said, reaching into her jacket pocket to withdraw a small wrapped package. "It's not much, but I thought you should have it." Inside the wrapping was the silver locket that had started their entire journey, its surface polished to shine like new. But when Rylan opened it, he found that the original photograph had been replaced with a recent picture of Mia working at her pottery wheel, her face radiant with concentration and joy. "She insisted on choosing the photo herself," Gabriella explained. "She said she wanted you to have a picture that showed her doing what you taught her, so you'd always remember that some lessons are strong enough to survive anything." Raylan closed the locket carefully and fastened the chain around his neck, feeling the weight of it settle against his chest like a talisman, protecting the love between a father and daughter that had proven stronger than death, stronger than separation. stronger than the carefully constructed grief that had once defined his entire existence. "There's something else," Gabriella continued, her voice shifting to something more vulnerable, more hopeful. "The foundation wants to establish permanent family integration facilities in 5 additional states over the next 3 years. They've asked me to oversee the expansion program, and they've asked you to develop the creative arts therapy protocols that would be replicated at each location." "That's incredible," Ryland said, understanding immediately that she was describing an opportunity to transform their work from a single experimental program into a national model for family-centered medical care. It would mean traveling together for several months each year, training staff at new facilities, helping families transition from traditional medical settings to integration programs. She paused, her sea-glass eyes holding his with the particular intensity that had become familiar during their most important conversations. "It would also mean formalizing our partnership, both professionally and personally." The proposal hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond career advancement. Gabriella was offering him the chance to spend the rest of his professional life helping families discover that healing happened best in community, that love could survive even the most devastating losses. That hope was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. But she was also offering him something more personal, a future built on shared purpose and mutual understanding, a love that had grown from recognition of common wounds rather than the desperate need to escape loneliness. "Mia would come with us," Gabriella added. "The expansion program includes educational components designed specifically for children who are transitioning from experimental medical care to normal life. She'd be helping to teach other kids that recovery is possible, that medical miracles don't have to define your entire identity." Before Ryland could respond, Mia appeared beside their bench, her clothes smudged with clay and her face glowing with the satisfaction of an afternoon spent creating something beautiful. "Dad, Miss Gabriella, look what I made." She held up a small ceramic bowl, its surface glazed in blues and greens that captured the colors of the lake, where her father had once learned to grieve and where her rescue had begun the long journey toward their reunion. "It's for you both," she continued, presenting the bowl with the formality of someone offering a treasured gift. "Mrs. Chun helped me with the glaze, and I carved this message inside." Ryland turned the bowl over to read the words his daughter had etched into the clay before firing. "Co-potters stick together forever. Forever." The message was simple, innocent, profound in the way that children's wisdom often transcended adult complexity. But looking at his daughter's hopeful expression, seeing Gabriella's smile reflected in her sea-glass eyes, Ryland understood that Mia had perfectly captured the truth about their unconventional family. They were co-potters in the deepest sense, people who understood that beautiful things could emerge from raw materials through patient, repeated attention, that broken pieces could be mended into something stronger than the original, that love was a craft requiring daily practice, but capable of creating miracles that defied every rational explanation. "Yes," Ryland said, his voice carrying certainty that surprised him with its completeness. "To all of it. The expansion program, the traveling, the partnership." He looked at Gabriella, then at Mia, then at the community spread out around them, where families were discovering that healing happened best when shared. Co-potters stick together forever. As the sun set behind the Vermont mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of evenings at Crescent Lake, Ryland felt the last barriers around his heart dissolve completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new opportunities to demonstrate that love could survive even the most absolute forms of loss. But tonight, surrounded by the people who had taught him that miracles were real and second chances were possible, Ryland Vance was exactly where he belonged, creating something beautiful from broken pieces, one careful touch at a time. 5 years later, the Vance-Larson family integration model had been established in 12 states, helping over 300 families reunite with children, whose lives had been saved through experimental medicine, Dr. Rylan Vance and Dr. Gabriella Larson were married in a ceremony attended by dozens of families whose lives had been transformed by their work, with Mia serving as the wedding potter, creating commemorative bowls for each guest that carried her father's teaching. Some broken things become more beautiful when they're carefully mended. Sometimes the most profound healing begins when we stop protecting ourselves from hope and start trusting that love can survive anything, even death, even time, even the careful walls we build around our hearts to keep them from breaking again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.